Hey guys. You are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku betrayed and became the world's greatest villain. Here is short summary. Heroes are born to save people. Villains are born to do the opposite. But what if someone who grew up idolizing heroes turned their back on them after facing the rejection of the world's best? This is the story of how Izuku Midoriya became the world's #1 villain. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Izuku Midoriya had grown up idolizing heroes. They were just so amazing. He dedicated his entire 15 years to analyzing everything about the heroes, which included strengths and weaknesses for their quirks, how they look and act towards the crowd, how tall they were, the list goes on and on. There were 13 of these books in total, and Midoriya had memorized every word in every book. People who found out would call him a stalker or a creep, but he wouldn't let that deter him from the dream he holds so dear. When Midoriya was 4 years old, he found out that he wouldn't be getting a quirk like all the rest of the kids in his class. He was quirkless, but he still kept dreaming. Every day, Midoriya and his mother, Inko, would watch an old video posted on the internet. It was the debut of the now #1 hero, All Might. Midoriya had always dreamed of growing up and becoming just like All Might. But when he found out that he wouldn't be able to develop his quirk, he was crushed. His whole world began crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do about it. Skip to now, and Izuku Midoriya is now 15 and still dreaming of becoming a hero. He entered his middle school class and sat down. The teacher stood up and greeted the class. Today, we find out what career path that you are all going to take. I already know that you all wish to take the hero route, but you must think about what high school you all wish to enroll in. Midoriya kept his head down on his desk. He stayed out of the spotlight, which is the exact opposite of what his childhood friend, Katsuki Bakugo, wished to do. He leapt up to his feet and called out, "Who cares where all these idiots want to go? All that matters is that I'm the only one that's going to get into the country's best one, UA." "Oh, that's right. Midoriya wants to get into UA as well," replied the teacher casually. Bakugo froze. He couldn't believe that someone else, let alone the quirkless nerd, wanted to get into the best school in Japan. Midoriya, meanwhile, just kept his head down on his desk whilst peeking up at Bakugo every few seconds. Next thing he knew, he was on the ground and his table had been split in two. Bakugo had just tried to blow him up with his quirk explosion. "What the hell, Deku?" Bakugo yelled, once again going for Midoriya. "I'm the only one that's supposed to be enrolling at UA. If you think I'm gonna let you get in with me, then you've got another thing coming." Bakugo then stormed out of the room and headed out the school. Midoriya was sent to the nurse's office to make sure he wasn't injured. Eventually, the final bell rang and Midoriya started his long journey home. "I know that it's a long shot, but I can get into UA. I still believe in myself, and as long as I believe in myself, then I can't give up on my dream," Midoriya thought to himself as he wandered into a tunnel which just so happened to be where a slimy villain was hiding out. Before Midoriya even had time to react, the villain wrapped itself around him and began suffocating him. Midoriya struggled as much as he could but began to realize that it was futile. But as he began to lose consciousness, there was a loud crash from behind the villain. He turned around to see the world's #1 hero standing there. "You should give up your running now, villain, because I am here," All Might called. The villain lashed out at him with his slime, but All Might easily dodged it and with one punch, managed to scatter the villain everywhere. Midoriya had lost consciousness by this point, and by the time he awoke, he was back on the street. He sat up and saw All Might standing in front of him. He screamed and backed away. "I'm very sorry for getting you caught in the middle of my battle, young man," All Might told him. "I took the time to sign your book for you as well. But I must be off now. Farewell, young man." As All Might turned around and got ready to leave, Midoriya finally shook himself from his shocked stupor and finally realized that All Might was actually here. But before he could even say thank you, All Might began to jump. All Might gave a sigh of relief once he made it into the air. He just managed to get away on time with a few moments of his power to spare. He was about to let out a laugh when he heard a strange noise from behind him. He turned his head and saw the green-haired kid from before hanging onto his leg. "What are you doing, kid?" Do you have any idea how much danger you just put yourself in by doing this? All Might called over the noise of the wind that was blowing past them. He couldn't believe the stupidity of this child. He decided that he would land on a nearby building and drop this kid off before he ran out of power. A few moments later he landed on the building with the kid and was getting ready to leave again. "I'm leaving now, young man. Please don't do that again," he said before facing the other direction. "Wait. I have to ask you something first," came a cry from behind him. All Might froze in his tracks. "I've always wanted to become a hero, but I don't have a quirk. Is there any chance that I can be a hero like you even though I'm quirkless?" Midoriya asked, finally finding the confidence to speak. He kept his head down and eyes shut, so he didn't even notice the hero standing barely 10 feet away begin to change. It was the hissing that made Midoriya open his eyes and look up at All Might, but was surprised to see a small, thin man who couldn't weigh any more than about 100 pounds. Midoriya once again found himself screaming to the skies as he struggled with the sight in front of him. What happened to All Might? Who are you? Are you an imposter? He was panicking. A lot. He didn't know what to do. "Listen, kid. I assure you that I am All Might," the man replied. "I'm gonna tell you something that only a select few people know about." Midoriya looked at him curiously. "You see, kid. I got in a fight about 5 years ago, and my respiratory system got ruined. I can only use my power for a few hours every day, and the rest of the time I look like this," All Might told him. Midoriya was completely horrified. He had no idea what to make of the situation. He just kept standing there, staring in shock at the shell of a hero in front of him. He would never have guessed that the world's #1 hero would actually be a little man who could barely stand up without struggling. "You see, kid. Heroes risk their lives every single day for the civilians of the world. We have to fight villains on a daily basis and it's incredibly difficult to do that without powers. So no, I don't think you can become a hero without a quirk," All Might said, with great sadness in his voice. Midoriya froze. He couldn't believe it. His years and years of dreaming about becoming a hero even without a quirk has been crushed by the world #1. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes. He had always known deep down that it couldn't be possible to be a hero without a quirk, but he was now facing the reality of it. All Might had already left and Midoriya was on his knees, completely breaking down. He stood up slowly, and began to make his way down the building and out the front door. On his walk back home he heard a voice coming from an alleyway nearby. He tried to ignore it, but his curiosity got the better of him and he made his way to the alleyway and he peeked inside. The last thing he remembered was a hand reaching out from the darkness and striking him on the side of the head, turning everything black. Midoriya began to slowly open his eyes. His head was pounding and he could barely see. Once his eyes adjusted he noticed that he was in a room. One with no windows. He tried to scream for help but there was some kind of tape stuck over his mouth. He then tried to stand up but once again his attempts were foiled as he found that he had been strapped down to a chair. Midoriya began to panic. He had been kidnapped and there was no chance at escape. Then he heard footsteps coming from outside. He tried to call out to them but again he was unsuccessful. Then the door opened and the lights came on which blinded Midoriya for a few seconds. Once his sight had readjusted, he noticed that he was in a bar. He looked towards the door and saw 2 men standing there. One had hands covering different parts of his body whilst the other was covered by a strange purple mist. They both looked incredibly intimidating and once again Midoriya got scared and tried to run away, only to find himself still bound to the chair. "Look, Kurogiri. Our little friend has awoken." It was the hand guy that spoke first. "Indeed he has, Shigaraki," Kurogiri replied. "Let us now ask him the question." Midoriya was panicking. The question? What question? Were they going to ask him how he wanted to die? Midoriya began whimpering behind the tape which brought the 2 men's attention back over to him. Shigaraki made his way towards Midoriya and he peeled the tape off. "Hello, kid. My name is Tamura Shigaraki and my misty friend over there is Kurogiri. We are the leaders of the League of Villains and we want you to join us," Shigaraki said, getting straight to the point. Midoriya looked at him. Join a group of villains? Why would he do that? Then he remembered what All Might said. "You see, kid, heroes risk their lives every single day for the civilians of the world. We have to fight villains on a daily basis and it's incredibly difficult to do that without powers. So no, I don't think you can become a hero without a quirk. Remembering this made Midoriya think about Shigaraki's offer. But why would you want me? Midoriya asked. I don't even have a quirk. That's precisely why we chose you. And also I heard you getting rejected by All Might. You may not be able to make it as a hero, kid. But as a villain, you are gonna be the best one that there is. Shigaraki replied. Midoriya thought harder about it. If I become a villain, then I could definitely get back at All Might for rejecting me like that, but why do I feel like I want revenge on him? After all, it isn't even his fault that I don't have a quirk, but it is because of him that I now feel resentment towards heroes after he told me that. Midoriya looked up to see a shocked look on the villain's face. Did I say all that out loud? He asked. His only answer was a nod from Shigaraki. He felt his face go beet red and went to cover his mouth with both his hands, but he was still strapped to the chair. Oh yeah, forgot to let you out of the chair. Shigaraki said, chuckling. He untied Midoriya and his hands immediately flew up to his face to try and hide his embarrassment. So then, kid, what will it be? Shigaraki asked. Are you going to join us and get your revenge on the heroes for denying you? I'm still not sure, replied Midoriya. Shigaraki thought to himself, then he remembered something. Well then, kid. Maybe what I have to say next will help you make up your mind, he said. I just remembered that you've been here for 3 days and not a single hero has tried to look for you. Your mother has been looking for you, but she's the only one. That did it. Midoriya took the villain's words to heart. Not one hero even tried to look for him. Not a single one. And he had been missing for 3 days as well. A group of people that he had looked up to since he was very young had abandoned him when he needed them to save him. Not even All Might tried, and he was in the city. Midoriya felt like a fire had been lit within him. He was going to destroy all the heroes. So what do you say, kid? Shigaraki asked again. Do you want to be like us? Do you want to be like us? Shigaraki asked, never taking his eyes off the boy in front of him. Midoriya kept his head facing down, his hair covering his face so that Shigaraki couldn't read him. What if I do become a villain? Thought Midoriya. Would that mean that I have to leave my old life behind? My friends and family? He looked up at Shigaraki, who had kept his eyes trained on him the whole time, waiting for his answer patiently. They locked eyes as Midoriya continued to debate with himself over whether to join the villains or not. After a few more minutes, Midoriya broke the silence between the two. Okay, Shigaraki. I accept your invitation, but on one condition. This perked Shigaraki's interest. Sure, he was glad that the kid said yes. But, he was actually placing conditions. Shigaraki already knew what the boy's condition would be. That he still leads a normal teenage life whilst being a villain behind the scenes. It's alright, kid. You can still lead a normal life, but you have to come to our home base at least 4 times a week, Shigaraki stated. Midoriya's bright, emerald eyes lit up at what Shigaraki had just said. He could still have a normal life whilst being a villain. Okay, Shigaraki. Midoriya said. You have yourself a deal. Midoriya stuck out his hand for Shigaraki to shake it, finalizing their deal. Shigaraki took Midoriya's hand, making sure to keep one finger up so as not to activate his disintegration quirk, and shook it. We expect to see you here on Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays and Sundays, kid. Shigaraki told him. As it's Thursday today, you can start today. Midoriya felt a rush of determination flow through him. He was going to show all of the heroes that doubted him that, even without a quirk, he was going to become the greatest villain that ever lived. He was going to start his training to become a villain today, and he was going to make the most out of it. Go and get on the uniform that Kurogiri has kindly gone and gotten for you, kid. And you'll have to thank him the next time you see him. Shigaraki said. After you are changed, go through those double doors beside the bar, and head straight down until you reach our little training room. And with that, Shigaraki made his way through the aforementioned double doors as Midoriya went on a hunt for a bathroom to change in. After a few minutes of searching, he finally found the bathroom and began to get changed. When he was finally changed, he looked at himself in the mirror. His training gear that had been provided to him by Kurogiri and Shigaraki had been custom tailored to fit him perfectly. The gear was a dark green tracksuit with a small utility belt that held a knife, a smoke grenade and a small capsule with white powder inside. Midoriya didn't want to do anything with it, so he put it back and continued to check out the rest of his gear. He had also been given a pair of bright green goggles that he tried on immediately. This would have made for a great hero costume. Midoriya thought, but quickly shook it out of his head. I need to stop comparing myself to a hero. I'm a villain now, and that's the way it's gonna stay. He finished getting ready and headed out the bathroom and back to the bar. He went through the double doors and started to run down the long corridor to the training room. When he finally made it, Shigaraki looked up and scowled at him. What took you so long, kid? He demanded. I've been waiting here for almost half an hour. I'm sorry, Shigaraki, Midoriya said. I was so caught up with how cool my new gear looks that I seem to have lost track of time. He bowed his head slightly in apology before looking back up at Shigaraki. It's fine, kid, Shigaraki said. Just don't make a habit of it. Yes, Shigaraki, Midoriya said. Anyway, let's get your training started, kid, Shigaraki told him. 3 weeks had passed since Izuku Midoriya made the decision to join Shigaraki and the League of Villains. He had been training with Shigaraki twice a day for the whole 3 weeks. He had learned the basics of hand-to-hand combat and how to wield and use a knife effectively. The one problem he faced, though, he still didn't have his own quirk. He kept his dream of becoming a late bloomer, but he still hadn't gained one. Shigaraki saw this as a problem, so on the 23rd night of Midoriya's stay, whilst the boy was sleeping upstairs, Shigaraki made his way to a small computer on the table next to the bar, and turned it on. Master, he said to the screen, can I make a request? A few seconds passed before a reply came through. Of course, what is it? It's about the kid, Shigaraki told the voice. He doesn't have a quirk, but still wishes to stay with us. I've spent the last 3 weeks teaching him basic combat, but I don't think it will be enough. So I wanted to ask if you would be able to give him one. I see, the voice replied. All right then, bring the child to me in 2 days. I would like some time to think about what quirk to give him. Of course, master. Thank you, Shigaraki said as he turned the computer off, ending the call. He then stood up and made his way to the bar counter and sat in one of the stools. Kurogiri stood there with a glass in hand, preparing a drink for Shigaraki. He sensed there was something troubling the young leader, but didn't wish to pry. He knew if Shigaraki wanted him to know what was on his mind, he would tell him. Over the last 3 weeks, Kurogiri had gotten to know Midoriya a little better. Whilst Shigaraki had focused on the hand-to-hand style of Midoriya's training, Kurogiri had helped him with handling and using a knife effectively. He had trained him to throw knives at a great speed to the point where you couldn't even see it until the target of the throw had been hit. But he knew Midoriya wouldn't be too much use in a fight against heroes. And Shigaraki had known this as well, which is why he asked the master if he could give young Midoriya a quirk. He handed Shigaraki his drink a moment later and began cleaning another glass. A few minutes passed before Shigaraki stood and left the bar without a word, closing the door behind him before making his way up the stairs and into his bedroom. Kurogiri sighed and went back to cleaning up the bar. A short while passed when there were footsteps on the stairs. Kurogiri paid no mind to it, thinking it was just Shigaraki going to the bathroom, but then the door to lead into the bar opened and in popped a certain green-haired villain in training. He yawned as he stepped into the bar, and sat down at the counter on the same stool that Shigaraki had been on not even 20 minutes before. A few more minutes passed before either of them said anything, Kurogiri being the one to break the silence. Is there something I can help you with, Midoriya? Any particular reason you are out of bed at 2:30 in the morning? Midoriya's face went slightly red at the second question. He was a bit embarrassed that he was about to ask Kurogiri for this at that particular time in the morning. Can I go out for a walk, Kurogiri? I can't sleep and I wanted to make sure that Shigaraki went to bed first before I came down here. I've been stuck in here with no fresh air for weeks and I want to go outside. I don't know why you want to go for a walk at this time or why you waited for Shigaraki to go to sleep first, but I suppose a little midnight stroll won't do too much harm. Kurogiri replied. As long as it's okay for me to put a tracker on you in case something were to happen to you whilst you were out. That's fine. Midoriya told the villain. I just want to go outside for a while. Okay then. Here's a timer, Kurogiri said as he handed a small black sphere to Midoriya. It has a timer set for 3:30. I want you back before the timer goes off. If you don't get back here before then, I'm going to have to assume that something bad has happened and I will come looking for you. Okay, Kurogiri. I'll be back before then, Midoriya said as he made his way out off the bar and into the alleyway outside. He took in a deep breath and sighed. He decided that a little walk around the park would do him some good, so he made his way out of the grimy alleyway and onto the city streets. Because it was so early in the morning, the streets were almost empty, apart from the odd car that passed by or somebody that had the same idea as him to go for a little early morning stroll. Midoriya pulled up his hood on the very small chance that one of the rare pedestrians that passed him recognized him as the missing kid that has been gone for weeks. And just as he turned the corner of the street that would lead him to the park's entrance, something caught his eye. It was a poster. A poster with his face on it that read, "Have you seen this person? If so, contact the number below." The number below belonged to his mother's house phone. And in that moment, he realized just how much he missed her, and just how worried she might be, having no idea that he was safe and sound with the villains. At first he thought about phoning the number and telling her that everything was going to be fine. That he was alive and well and she didn't have to worry, but he knew he couldn't. So with a heavy heart and a loud sigh, he wiped the tears he wasn't even aware that he had shed and continued towards the park. Upon reaching the park, he was suddenly aware how peaceful it was at night. There were no birds chirping, kids running around, or adults chatting. Sure, there were night animals like badgers and foxes, but they left him alone, and vice versa. Midoriya had been walking for about 5 minutes when he came across a bench near the center of the park. This wasn't just any old bench though, this was the bench him and his mother used to eat ice cream on during their visits to the park. He sat on the bench and closed his eyes for a few moments before movement beside him startled him and he jumped up, yelping. He looked up and saw a boy, who looked around his age, standing there. He looked odd, his entire body seemed to be split in half, red and white. He had a scar over the left side of his face. This strange boy never took his eyes off of Midoriya. By this point, Midoriya was feeling slightly intimidated by this boy, but also intrigued. He kept a hand enclosed on a knife in his pocket, just in case the boy decided to attack him. The boy was still staring intently at him, as if trying to figure something out. Then, he broke the silence with his first words to Midoriya. "I know who you are." Midoriya's eyes widened. This boy knew who he was. He began to panic, prepared to turn and run away, but found out that he couldn't move. He noticed that his feet were now extremely cold, so he looked down and saw that they had been frozen in place. An icy trail led all the way to the boy's right foot. "Don't bother trying to run," the boy told him, voice just as cold as the ice that came from him. "You won't get anywhere, and besides, I just want to talk to you." Midoriya began to calm down from his frantic state after hearing that last part. He just wanted to talk, that's fine. Maybe he could convince the boy to set him free so that he could escape, or even take the other guy down. Realizing the latter most certainly wouldn't work, Midoriya remembered the timer, still ticking down in his hoodie pocket. "Okay, but can you please free my feet?" Midoriya asked the boy. "I promise you that I won't run." The other boy stood silent for a moment, before the hiss of melting ice as Midoriya noticed something else. The boy had ice and fire quirk. The perfect combination for an attacking quirk. Remembering his hero analysis books, Midoriya's mind began trying to figure out which hero had a fire quirk. Endeavor, the number 2 hero in the entire world. Had he ran into this boy a few weeks ago, Midoriya might have started going full fanboy on the fact that this guy was Endeavor's son. But that was an old Midoriya, that wasn't who he was now. He was a villain in training, with no time to be a hero fanboy. When he was released, he sat back down on the bench and the boy sat down next to him. Midoriya decided that it would be best if they properly introduced himself to one another. "Okay, we seem to have gotten off on the wrong foot, so let me introduce myself properly," Midoriya said, trying his best to put on a believable smile. He was quite annoyed that his feet had been frozen in place and the fact that this boy would never let him get away. "My name is Izuku Midoriya, although you already knew that. I'm the kid that has been missing for the last 3 weeks. Now it's your turn." The boy remained quiet for a moment, before sighing. "Shoto Todoroki," he finally said. "Okay. Nice to meet you, Todoroki," Midoriya said, smiling again. He noticed that his mouth was beginning to hurt from smiling so much. "So what do you need to talk to me about?" I want to know what happened to you, Todoroki replied. Posters about your disappearance have been all over the city. All Might has been leading the search party for you. Of course, Midoriya knew that All Might was looking for him to make sure that his secret was safe. His secret. Midoriya made a mental note to tell Kurogiri when he got back, and then Shigaraki in the morning. But first, he had to get back to the bar, so he had to continue stalling Todoroki until the timer ran out and Kurogiri would come and save him. I was kidnapped, taken to a strange, unknown place and kept there for weeks. But I managed to escape and now I'm hiding in the park until they stop looking for me and I can go home, he said. Well, why don't you go to the police? Or find a hero that can protect you? Todoroki asked him. Because I don't want anyone else getting involved in my problems, Midoriya replied. As Todoroki opened his mouth to ask another question, a small beeping sound could be heard from Midoriya's pocket, and Todoroki saw the other boy smile widely. Wait. That wasn't a smile, it was a grin. A rather sinister-looking one at that. Maybe it was his eyes playing tricks on him. But he didn't have time to do anything else, because a second later, a bright light flashed in his eyes and he heard Midoriya calling out to someone named Kurogiri. When his vision cleared, Midoriya was gone. Todoroki looked around for him, but there was not a single trace of the other boy anywhere. Giving up, he continued to walk around the park, hoping to see Midoriya again one day, safe and sound. After the flash, Midoriya escaped with Kurogiri back to the safety of the bar. Midoriya stumbled out of the portal and collapsed into one of the booths, still slightly blinded himself by the flash grenade that Kurogiri had thrown between him and Todoroki. When his vision had cleared, Midoriya looked up at Kurogiri apologetically for not being back on time, and felt that the man was owed an explanation. Considering what he perceived as a threat to Midoriya's safety, he could at least tell Kurogiri what happened. Almost as if reading his mind, Kurogiri sat down opposite him in the booth and waited patiently for Midoriya to start talking. Midoriya took a deep breath and told Kurogiri everything. From the posters, to the fact that he missed his mother and wished he could go and visit her, the walk to the park and the bench, including telling him the significance of that bench to him. The mysterious Todoroki that appeared out of nowhere and froze his feet to the ground to stop him running away from him, how he recognized Midoriya as the missing kid and tried to pry where he disappeared out of him, and finally how Kurogiri appeared just in time to save him. By the time he was done, Midoriya was completely out of breath, having gone through almost that entire explanation without pausing to refill his lungs with air. Meanwhile, Kurogiri pondered whether this Todoroki person would become a problem down the road, and if he needed to be eliminated. He put that in the back of his mind for the moment and finally spoke to Midoriya. Midoriya, I'll have a talk with the master about letting you go home to visit your family. Speaking of master, you're going to see him in a couple of days. He has a surprise for you. Midoriya perked up at this, realizing that he will finally get to meet this master that Kurogiri and Shigaraki have been referring to for weeks and that he had a surprise for him. This got Midoriya quite excited about this. And also, Kurogiri was going to try and get him permission to go home. Thank you, Kurogiri, he said, bowing his head in thanks. There is no need for thanks, Midoriya. Remember, you are a villain, and villains do not need to thank people, Kurogiri replied. Now, get to bed. Midoriya nodded his head and ran out the door and hurried upstairs to get back into bed as Kurogiri went off to clean his bar again. The next 2 days went by in a flash for Midoriya, who spent the entire time working on his training with the bar's other occupants. And, before he knew it, the time had come to go and see this master that Kurogiri and Shigaraki had been talking about for weeks. He got himself ready to go and made his way downstairs to the bar where Kurogiri was waiting for him. He gave a slight nod to the man to make him aware that he was ready, and Kurogiri opened up a portal leading straight to where the master was. Midoriya stepped through the portal, closely followed by Kurogiri, and they came out to a place that Midoriya didn't really expect the puppet master behind the villains to be hiding out, but it was so unthinkable that it was genius on the master's part. The thing Midoriya did not expect to see at all, though, was what the master looked like. As he looked at this man, if you could even call him that anymore, he noticed that he had almost no facial features at all. In fact, all that covered the upper half of his face and the top of his head were scars. The man had no eyes, ears, nose, or even hair. There were also many tubes sticking out of his neck as if they were the only thing keeping him alive. If Midoriya had come across this man a month or so ago, he would have ran screaming in terror. Even though Kurogiri had also been helping him become less of a scared little child, he still at that moment wanted to run away screaming in terror. The man looked like something you would see chasing the protagonist of a horror film, or one of those circus freaks that were put on show for people to laugh at, like the Elephant Man. Midoriya shuddered. He dreaded to think what must have happened to this man for him to become this monstrosity. But he didn't cower away, which surprised him. He was thankful to Kurogiri for that little bit of extra teaching to stop him being scared of everything that he felt threatened by. After a few more minutes of pause, the man began to speak. Izuku Midoriya. I've heard so much about you from Shigaraki and Kurogiri. His voice was raspy and graveled, as if it had been ground into a wall or something. Come forward, I have something for you. Midoriya hesitated, then stepped towards the man until he was only a foot or so away, then stood completely still again. For someone who was hooked up to life support and had little to no face, still came across as incredibly intimidating. After another moment, the man began to reach forward and, instinctively, Midoriya recoiled away from him. The man stopped his advancement and lowered his arm slightly. I promise you this won't hurt at all, as long as your body accepts what I'm going to give you, that is, the man told him. Midoriya, finally plucking up the courage to say something, asked, and what might that be, sir? A quirk. The man replied. You see Midoriya, my name is one I share with my quirk. All for one. It allows me to take other people's quirks and use them for myself, but it also allows me to give other people those quirks as well. Take, for example, the one I'm about to give to you, metal manipulation. This will allow you to control anything metallic. Do you understand? Midoriya was in shock, frozen in place, staring at All for One with an unbelieving expression. He was getting a quirk, a real quirk. What was once just a silly dream, was now becoming a reality, and it was all thanks to All for One. He didn't say anything for a few minutes, for fear that he would either say something he may regret or burst out into tears. After he gathered himself, he glanced towards Kurogiri and then back to All for One. I understand, sir. I'll try my best to handle the quirk you give me. That's what I like to hear, someone with guts, All for One said, laughing. Or, at least, it sounded like he was laughing. He beckoned Midoriya towards him again, and this time, when he went to touch Midoriya, he didn't flinch or jump back. All for One placed his hand on Midoriya's head and it began to glow red. Midoriya felt the surging of something shooting from All for One's hand and into his head, flowing freely through his body. After a few seconds, he began to feel it. His head began to grow immensely hot and pain began to rack all throughout his body. He collapsed to the floor, screaming and writhing around. After a moment he lay still, convulsing slightly every now and then. It doesn't look like his body accepted the quirk, All for One said, a hint of what could be perceived as sympathy coming from his voice. But Midoriya, miraculously, shot up into a sitting position and began gasping for breath. All for One couldn't believe it, someone had managed to fight for the quirk, and win. In all his years, even the strongest-willed could not make the quirks he gave them theirs. But this child, who believed with all of his being that he could hold this quirk, managed to come out relatively unscathed. He quickly motioned for Kurogiri to come to Midoriya's aid and help him back to his feet. All for One cleared his throat. Well, that was certainly unexpected. Congratulations, Midoriya. You now own a quirk. But we have more business to attend to before you go, he said. Midoriya looked at him, confused. There was more? He gave a short nod to All for One to let the man know that he was listening, so All for One continued. Midoriya, I think it's time that you went home. Home. Midoriya had almost completely forgotten what it looked like. The fact that he was now allowed to go home to his mother filled him with the utmost happiness. He was able to see his mother again. His sweet, innocent mother who had no idea what he was becoming. But he was sure that she would be happy to see him alive anyway. The reason I am allowing this is because you will need to go back to school and keep up your academics, All for One said, pulling Midoriya out of his stupor. You are being given your first mission now. To infiltrate UA and help us destroy all of the future generation of heroes. And you can't do that if you are unable to even get in. This excited Midoriya. His first mission as a villain in training. This had to be the greatest day of his life. Not only did he start the day learning a great new trick with a knife in his training with Kurogiri, which might be very useful for him later down the line, but he had also gained a new quirk, been given permission to go home and been given his first mission by All for One. Now, in order for this to work, I have set a few conditions for you to follow, All for One continued. First, you must continue to come to training. The days I have set will be in a schedule one have given to Kurogiri. Second, you must keep a high grade in school, otherwise you will not be able to take the UA entrance exam. And finally, you must never tell anybody about us, not your friends, your family, or even a pet. Do you understand? Midoriya nodded. This was a lot to take in. Luckily, he was very good at processing information and storing it away for later use. All for One waited a few more minutes before continuing farther. I want you to go straight to the police station when you are dismissed, Midoriya. No doubt this boy you bumped into has told them about you, and what you told him. Speaking of that, I want you to continue with the story you told that boy and tell it to the police as well. I have arranged for 2 low-life street thugs to take the fall for your kidnapping. After that you will return home, where I have left a package for you containing your schedule and everything else that you will need. Now, UA's entrance exams are in just over 9 months. Do not disappoint me, Midoriya. I'll do everything in my power to get the job done, sir, Midoriya replied. This was it. He was finally needed. It was now his chance to prove himself to All for One in the League of Villains. His chance to show that he was worth something in the ranks of this group. But it was a big ask, and Midoriya was aware of that, but he could do it. He had to. Everything he had been doing for the last few weeks was to prepare him for his first mission. That's the spirit, Midoriya. Now, unless you have any questions, you are dismissed, All for One told him. Midoriya shook his head, letting All for One know that he did not have any questions at the moment. All for One acknowledged this by motioning to Kurogiri for him to open a portal to the bar. Come now, Midoriya, Kurogiri said from behind the boy. Midoriya gave a quick bow to All for One in farewell and ran over to Kurogiri and through the portal back to the bar. Upon reaching the bar, Midoriya immediately started laughing. Kurogiri just stood there, watching him, until he finished. What's so funny, Midoriya? He asked. Midoriya looked up at him. I just can't imagine how much better this day could get for me. It's hilarious just how good it's been, he replied. Well, it's not finished yet, you still have work to do, Kurogiri told him. You need to go to the police station now and stick to the story you told that boy a few days ago. Then you go home and open the package that has been left for you. I will see you soon, Midoriya. Midoriya nodded and ran out the bar, through the alleyway and onto the street. He couldn't remember where the police station was, so he had to ask for directions. He looked around and saw a girl a few meters away from him. He walked up to her and put on a smile. Hi, he said, making his presence known. I was wondering if you could tell me where the police station is. The girl looked up at him and smiled back. She was really good looking. Midoriya had to fight the blush that was coming to his face. He had made a mistake coming to talk to this girl. Midoriya didn't have much experience talking to other girls. They always made him feel really flustered. But he forced himself to stay composed and wait for the girl to answer his question. Oh, it's about 3 blocks from her, the girl replied. If you go to the end of the street and turn right, then head straight down there and turn left, you should see the police station from there. Thanks a lot, Midoriya replied. He turned and went to start running but tripped over his feet. He closed his eyes, waiting for the impact to happen, but it never came. He opened his eyes to see that he was a few inches off the ground. He yelled out and scrambled to just stand up, but it just made things worse because he started floating in the air. He then felt a hand on his shoulder, pulling him up until he was standing upright again. He looked to his right and saw it was the girl who had her hand on his shoulder. Sorry, she said. I didn't think you would mind me saving you. Oh no, it was no problem. Thank you, Midoriya replied hurriedly, but I really got to go now, bye. And with that, he was off to the police station again. He reached the end of the street and turned right, then down to the end of that street and turned left. There he saw the police station and made a beeline for it, having already wasted enough time today. Upon reaching the police station, he burst through the doors and ran up to the desk, panting for breath. The attendant at the desk stood there waiting for him to regain himself and start talking. After about 5 minutes of puffing and panting, being as unfit as he is, Midoriya was finally able to talk to the attendant. "My name is Izuku Midoriya," he said. "I was kidnapped a little under a month ago, and I managed to escape. I need to speak to someone who can help me." The attendant nodded and made his way to the back of the station. He came back a moment later with a detective of some sort. He wore a suit and tie as opposed to the standard uniform that all the other cops wear. "Izuku Midoriya," the detective said. "My name is Naomasa Sukachi. If you would like to come with me, we can go somewhere private to talk. Sorry, but I'm not going to add in the interview. It's basically just going to go the same as the talk between Midoriya and Todoroki. If anyone would like me to add the interview in, let me know and I can add it in at a later date." After the interview wrapped up, Midoriya was escorted to a car by Detective Sukachi so that the man could take him back to his house. Midoriya had requested that he be taken home so that his mother didn't have to come and pick him up, and also because he thought it would be a nice surprise for her to see him in person rather than get a phone call from the police. When they reached his house, Midoriya thanked the detective for the lift and got out the car, before walking up the path to the front door. He opened it, silently thankful that it was unlocked, and entered the house. As he shut the door, he heard a clatter coming from the kitchen, followed by a "Who's there?" After he didn't reply to the voice, he could hear footsteps coming out to the hallway. Out of the kitchen came a short, plump woman with dark green hair, similar to Midoriya's. She was holding a knife out in front of her, but her uncontrollable shaking meant that it wouldn't be very effective had he decided to attack her. It took her only a second to recognize who was in her hallway though, and the knife was tossed aside. In a few strides, Inko Midoriya had reached her son, and pulled him into a hug. "Izuku," she said, beginning to cry heavily onto his shoulder. "I can't believe you're safe." Midoriya returned her gesture by wrapping his arms around her as well. "Neither can I, Mom," he replied. "But you don't have to worry anymore, because I'm home." Several moments passed before Inko finally pulled away from her son. She stood up straight, tears still streaming down her face, and looked at Midoriya's face. He was trying in vain to keep himself from crying as well. "Mom, I'm just gonna head up to my room now," Midoriya said to her. She just nodded, not trusting herself to say anything without bursting into tears again. He walked past her, down the hall to his bedroom door. The word, "Izuku," in colorful block capitals was nailed to his door. He remembered the day the wooden letters had first been put up, to show the whole world that out of all the rooms that you could walk into, this one was his. He opened the door and stepped inside, closing it once again behind him. The first thing he noticed when he walked into his room though, was how clean and tidy it was. The place had been very well kept by his mother in his month-long absence. His room was still filled with all things All Might, from posters to figurines, All Might bed covers, wallpaper. Even his small alarm clock that he kept on his bedside table was in the shape of the #1 hero's face, right down to the 2 buddy spikes protruding from the top. Midoriya decided he would get those all replaced in due time, but he had other things to do right now. He made his way over to his bed and, just like All for One had told him, he found his schedule lying there. He picked it up and looked it over. On Tuesday he had combat training with Shigaraki, on Thursday he had tactical training with Kurogiri, and on Saturday he had quirk training with All for One. Monday, Wednesday and Friday were his study days and Sunday was his day off to do whatever he pleased. He placed the schedule back on his bed and picked up the other item that had been laid out for him. It was a package with a note written on it. Midoriya ripped the note off the package and began to read it. "Midoriya, I have left you a package that contains a cell phone and a tracking device. The tracking device must be kept with you at all times in the event that something happens to you. The cell phone contains the numbers of the bar, Kurogiri and myself in case you have an inquiry to make. This phone is also to be kept with you at all times. Make sure you stick to the schedule that you were given." All for One. Midoriya placed the note back down and picked the package up again. He opened it and took the phone out and turned it on. Immediately the screen flashed and the home screen popped up. Midoriya clicked on the contacts button and, sure enough, the numbers of the 3 aforementioned came up on the screen. Midoriya decided he would wait until later to phone Kurogiri and let him know that he had made it home and put his phone back into his pocket. The last item that All for One had given him was still in the package, so he removed it from the brown paper and inspected it more closely. It was reasonably small. It could easily go into his pocket or on the back of his ear without being noticed. So that's what he did. He turned the little device on and put it behind his ear. His green hair more than long enough to cover it. Once he was done, he sat down on his bed and looked at his clock. 5:46 p.m. it read. It was then that he noticed how hungry he was. Standing up once more, he quickly hid the schedule and phone in his desk drawer and made his way to the kitchen where he found his mom cooking. "Hi Mom," he said as he entered the kitchen. "What's for dinner?" Inko turned to look at her son. "Tonight we are having kare raisu. Rice with curry. Just give me a few minutes and it will be ready. Why don't you go and set up the table whilst you wait?" Midoriya gave a nod and made his way into the dining room to set the table. Just as he finished, Inko came through with a pair of steaming plates and placed them down on the table. The Midoriyas sat at the table and dug into their meals. Dinner went by rather quick with small talk between the two. At the end of their meal, Midoriya offered to do the dishes before heading off to bed. The next morning came with a 7 a.m. alarm. Midoriya got himself up, took a shower and put his uniform on for the first time in a month. With a quick goodbye to his mom, he was out the door and on his way to school. The walk there was as uneventful as it had always been. Midoriya kept his head down as he walked, trying to make sure that he wasn't recognized from the posters that his mom had littered around the city. Eventually he reached his destination and walked through the front gates and up to the doors. He could feel the stares that were on him as he walked and it made him feel slightly uncomfortable. He reached the doors and they were a temporary safe haven for him until he would get to the class. He went to the principal's office to re-enroll at the school, even though he was never taken off registration in the first place. The school board probably didn't even care that he had been absent for a whole month. After that he made his way to class, stopping on the way to use the bathroom, and walked into the room. He opened the door to the classroom, and the silence that greeted him when he walked in was almost deafening. Everyone's eyes were on him. Once again, Midoriya felt himself becoming very uncomfortable. He made his way to his old desk and sat down. "Are you being serious? I'm off for 2 days and I find out that damn nerd is back." Midoriya sighed. Kachan. Wandering through the forest that surrounded the park near their local elementary school, they came to a stop at their usual spot. The 2 4-year-old boys sat on the ground next to an old sakura tree, its small pink petals blossoming and standing out against the green and brown of the rest of the forest around them. Bakugo Katsuki sat down on the grass, leaning his back against the trunk of the sakura tree. He was accompanied, as per usual, by one Midoriya Izuku. The pair had been good friends for a while, beginning to talk to each other after Midoriya had told Bakugo how cool his quirk was after seeing it for the first time. Midoriya sat down next to Bakugo and looked around the forest. He spotted something darting around the base of a tree about 10 feet away. It was a small squirrel. Midoriya continued to stare at it as it continued shooting around the tree, and then it ran off, its small form disappearing into the bushes at the other side of the tree. "What are you looking at, Deku?" came a voice behind him, making him jump and pulling him back into reality. He turned to see Bakugo's eyes staring at him. "I just saw a squirrel running around over there," Midoriya replied, pointing to the tree where the small animal had been not a moment ago. "And I wish you would stop calling me Deku. Kachan." Anger flashed in the other boy's blood-red eyes. Midoriya jumped to his feet, ready to run at the slightest hint of danger. But Bakugo was fast, a lot faster than Midoriya, and he had a fistful of his shirt a split second later. Bakugo slammed Midoriya against the sakura tree. "I can call you whatever the hell I want, Deku," he shouted. Midoriya struggled to get out of Bakugo's grip. "Kachan, please let me go," he pleaded desperately, still struggling against the other boy's much stronger grip. Midoriya had never been very strong. In his defense, he was only 4, but Bakugo was so much stronger than he was and they were the same age. Bakugo raised his right hand up to Midoriya's face, clenched it into a fist, and punched him. Hard, right on the nose. There was absolutely nothing that Midoriya could do about it as Bakugo punched him again and again. Eventually, the blows stopped, and Bakugo let Midoriya go and the latter collapsed to the ground in a bloody heap. "I call you Deku because it means that you can't do anything, so it fits you perfectly," Bakugo said as he walked away. Midoriya just laid there for a few minutes, tears streaming down his face. Eventually, unconsciousness overtook him, but not before he could think 2 words. "I'm worthless." Midoriya would never forget that day. It was the first time that Bakugo had ever physically hurt him. He was thinking of that moment right now, because he found himself in that exact same position from before. Bakugo had stormed into the room and now had Midoriya's shirt in his left hand and pinned to the back wall of the classroom. Midoriya always remembered how useless he felt the first time. But thanks to the last month of his life, he didn't feel useless anymore. Before he was Deku, worthless and weak. But now he was Midoriya Izuku, supervillain in training, and he wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. As Bakugo lifted his fist to punch Midoriya, he took the opportunity to grab the arm. This took Bakugo by surprise and he let go of Midoriya's shirt. This only helped Midoriya turn the tables on him, quite literally in fact, because he flipped Bakugo over his shoulder and through a nearby table, which snapped in half under the force that Bakugo was driven through. Midoriya was breathing heavily, frozen in the same position he had been when he drove Bakugo through the table. He was staring into the eyes of the shell-shocked Bakugo, who was more surprised than hurt at the fact Midoriya had just sent him through a table. For the first time ever, Bakugo found himself on his back, looking up at Midoriya. The thought of it filled him with pure rage, and he began pulling himself up, ready to blow the other boy's brains out. He stopped when he looked at Midoriya. He actually felt a chill go through his body. Midoriya was staring, glaring at him with such intensity that he felt his body freeze. His once bright and vibrant green eyes were now dark and filled with nothing but venom. He felt scared. For the first time in his life, he felt scared. Midoriya had never stood up him, ever. The boys never took their eyes off each other, glaring daggers at the other. They had to be hauled out of the classroom by their classmates. They were each taken to the principal's office and given a 3-day suspension each. Midoriya hung his head in his hands. He knew that he would have to tell All For One about his suspension, and he was sure to get an earful from the master. But he was prepared for it. He wasn't sure he wanted his mother to find out though. He had never gotten into trouble in his life, and he had also missed a month's worth of school. Now he was going to miss the rest of the week, with it being a Wednesday. He wouldn't be back in until the Monday. The boys were both kicked out of the school and sent on their merry way. The longer Midoriya spent walking home, the more nervous he got about telling both his mother and All For One. He knew it would be bad. The punishments were not as bad as he thought they would be. He was barred from the bar for 3 weeks by All For One, which stopped him from doing any training. But this was fine because he was also grounded for 2 weeks by his mother and forced into a dual apology along with Bakugo. They had both been told they had to apologize to each other by their parents. Midoriya knew that the coming months would be difficult if he ever wanted to get into UA. All For One and the rest of the League of Villains were counting on him. He had around 9 months left after his suspension from training was over, and he got straight to work. Going almost a month without being allowed to train his new quirk had left Midoriya a very small window of time to get the hang of it and improve as much as he could. His quirk that had been given to him by his now mentor and master, All For One, was known as metal manipulation. This allows him to control anything metallic within a 10-foot radius. All For One was trying to train him to widen that radius to about 15 to 16 feet. This would give him an advantage if the entrance exam's practical assessment required you to use anything metallic. The first thing he learned was to move things around, gradually getting better at controlling things. Unfortunately, because the current reach he had with it was so small, as soon as the items reached outside of the 10-foot boundary, they just dropped to the floor with a clang. Eventually, he managed to master moving things around and being able to keep them within the 10-foot area that he had to work with. The next thing that All For One wanted him to work on was how to crush a large metal object, or even just make it collapse in on itself. The weeks and months went on until finally the day came, the UA entrance exams. Midoriya would be lying if he said he wasn't in the least bit nervous. His palms were sweating as he looked at the large gates that lay out in front of him. A lot was riding on this. He had to get in, otherwise the last 9 months would have been all for naught. He took a deep breath and walked into the grounds. There were many people there, potentially hundreds, preparing to take the exams just like him. Many people stood out to him. There was a girl that looked like a pink alien, a small toddler-looking boy that appeared to have grapes growing out of his head, and a birdman. That was all that Midoriya could think to describe him, just to name a few. One person he hadn't seen though was the half-and-half guy that he met a few days before he went home to his mother. Maybe he wasn't interested anymore, or just wasn't accepted. The doors opened and they all walked into the large briefing room that UA had so they could explain how everything was gonna go. Sorry, but I'm not gonna sit and go through that entire thing. If you have seen the anime, then just imagine that it went like that. I am gonna give a summary of it here though. There were going to be written exams to test each students in different subjects just to gauge on their intellectual strengths and weaknesses. Afterward, there was going to be a practical exam with the villains being exactly what Midoriya wanted to hear. Robots. He knew as soon as he heard that he was getting into UA. He already had the written exams down to a T, as he had almost worked himself to death studying, until All for One found this out and commanded Shigaraki to beat the hell out of him. He never wanted that to happen again. It had happened almost 6 months ago. He could still feel the bruises from that day. He still worked hard, but not as hard as he had been because he didn't want to be beaten within an inch of his life by Shigaraki again. The written exams went by rather fast and Midoriya was as confident as ever heading into the practical exam. He realized on his way to the exam that he had never felt this confident about anything he had done in his life. The practical exam was gonna have them fighting robots. Robots were made of metal. His quirk was called metal manipulation. It was a perfect fit. The way the practical exam was set up is that they had a limited amount of time to destroy as many robots as possible. Each robot had a number on it which would count as the score being either 1, 2 or 3. There was a fourth one which they had been advised to stay away from, which was worth no points. The exam started and it was immediate chaos. Hero wannabes running around fighting off robots, whilst Midoriya just made them cave in with ease. After 5 minutes he had accumulated 36 points, the most out of anyone there at that moment. But there was still a ways to go. He continued destroying robots, but found that it was beginning to wear him down a lot. He hadn't been doing a lot of intense training to build up his quirk in a way that it wouldn't wear him down through overusing it. At this point he wasn't sure if he could continue when the ground began to shake. Buildings were beginning to fall about 50 feet from him. Then people began running away from the falling buildings, but he found himself running towards it. It was a huge robot, the 0.1. Before he could stop himself, he had raised his arm up and began to run closer to it. He spotted something out of the corner of his eye. Trapped underneath a pile of rubble was a girl. He had seen her before. It was that girl who helped him find the police station that day after he had left the bar to go home. She had helped him, and now it was his turn to help her. He ran up to the robot and began to try and crush it. It was beginning to strain him a lot, but the robot was beginning to spark and crack. After about 20 seconds he managed to crush the robot completely, and he collapsed to the ground and passed out. He awoke not even a moment later to see a small, old lady standing over him. He sat up and looked at her curiously. "That was quite a show you put on there, Sonny. I'm impressed with your skill and also that you saved that poor girl that was trapped. You're a real hero, you know." Midoriya wasn't happy with that at all. He wasn't a hero, he was just repaying a favor from a long time ago. "I'm not that much of a hero," he replied, looking around to see that everyone was around him. He stood up straight, before saying, "I just did what anyone else would have had they actually stopped and noticed she was in trouble." With that, he made his way to the exit without sparing a glance at the wannabe heroes. He knew that his words had stung them, but they needed to hear it. The fact that a villain in training was a better hero than all of them combined disgusted him. He had to eliminate them all. Whilst awaiting the results of his entrance exams, Midoriya continued harnessing his skills with the League of Villains. He had improved greatly over the last 10 months and was extremely confident that he could make it into UA with the top scores depending on his results of the written exams. He already knew that he had aced the practical exam, so it all came down to his intelligence. 2 days after his exam, he was summoned by All for One. Kurogiri arrived to pick him up from his house and take him straight there. When they arrived, Kurogiri said his farewell to Midoriya and left, leaving him alone with All for One. Midoriya made his way through the darkened room to where All for One was sitting and bowed his head. "Midoriya," he said, "I have summoned you here to let you know that I have a job for you." Midoriya couldn't stop himself from getting excited. His very first mission. He didn't allow himself to get too carried away and stayed silent, allowing All for One to continue. "What I want you to do is go and retrieve something for me. It's a briefcase located at a club about 4 blocks from the bar. Kurogiri has all the things you will need back at the bar. Go." With that, Midoriya turned to the portal and walked through. The briefing was short from Kurogiri as All For One had explained most of what he was going to do, but Kurogiri gave him some tips as to what he should do if he is discovered. He also handed him a fake ID which made him the legal age to be in the club. Midoriya took it all in and processed the information. He had always been good at stuff like that, being able to work through problems and figuring out solutions as well as taking in all kinds of information and storing it for later, like a filing cabinet in his mind. Remember Midoriya, this is an infiltrate and extract. Be smart and think things through before you do anything. Good luck, Kurogiri told him before he headed out of the bar and to the club that was a mere few blocks from the bar. Upon arriving at his destination, he noticed a bouncer outside the club, which means he would need a distraction to slip inside. Just then, as his luck would have it, two middle-aged drunk men stumbled and rolled out of the bar in a brawl. Their punches were sloppy and their slurred insults indecipherable. The bouncer then did what his job description said and went to break up the fight. Midoriya realized he had only 10 to 20 seconds to slip into the bar, so he made his move. He pulled his hood up so he couldn't be recognized by the cameras on the outside and he just walked in. Once inside, he had to make his way to the VIP area at the other side of the rather large club. Luckily, with it being a weekday, the club wasn't too full. Midoriya was able to move rather easily between the drunken occupants of the dance floor. He had a bit of difficulty trying to get past a dancer who was a little more on the larger side, but besides that, made it through without much hassle. Getting to the VIP area was a rather simple task, getting in would be a completely different matter. Midoriya also realized that he wouldn't have much time before security came looking for the guy who just waltzed in without being checked by the bouncer. He had to think and move quickly, and he knew just what to do. He waited a moment and saw someone walking out of the VIP area, so he walked towards him and made sure to stumble right into him. He stepped away and started apologizing profusely to the man. The man just huffed and stormed off. Midoriya walked up to the bouncer at the entrance to the VIP area and showed him his newly acquired pass and the fake ID Kurogiri had handed him before he left. One of the training sessions with Kurogiri had Midoriya learning to pickpocket in the event that something like that was ever needed. And Midoriya was grateful that Kurogiri devoted one of the training sessions to teach him such a valuable skill for situations such as this one. After being granted access, Midoriya had to get upstairs to where the briefcase was. That was simple enough and he made it to the room that Kurogiri said the briefcase would be. He listened for voices and when there weren't any, he tried the handle. Locked. So he used another valuable skill that Kurogiri had taught him, lockpicking. It was this moment that Midoriya realized just how skilled and talented Kurogiri actually was, and was glad that he taught Midoriya all of these skills. Midoriya had to use his small pocket knife to get the door open, and after a few attempts, managed to get the door open. He made his way inside and saw the briefcase lying there on a desk. This is a bit too easy, Midoriya thought aloud. You never know, kid. Your mission might not be over yet, a voice came from behind him, making Midoriya jump slightly at the sudden noise. He turned to see a man there with a mask over his face, and a gun in his hand, pointed directly at Midoriya. I've known about All For One's little ploy from the beginning, the man said. As soon as I took the briefcase from him I knew he would try and take it back from me. Little did I know, he would send a child to retrieve it for him. The man started laughing at this, which made Midoriya shake in anger. He was being mocked by this man, and he wouldn't stand for it. He just needed an opening and he could make a move. I've called the police. But I wouldn't mind sending you back to All For One with a few holes in your chest, kid, the man told him. Midoriya had his back to the desk and reached behind him to grab the briefcase. He prayed that nothing valuable was inside and threw the briefcase at the man and charged at him. The case hit the man on the head with such force that it knocked him backwards and made him drop his gun. With the man's guard down, Midoriya took his chance and pounced on him, knocking both of them to the floor. Although clearly being the better fighter out of the two, Midoriya found he was completely out-muscled and the man was able to just throw him off. With Midoriya finally off of him, the man then made for his gun and picked it up, although the gun was also grasped by Midoriya who had also gone for it. The two kept wrestling over the gun for a few more minutes. Then, a gunshot rang out through the whole of the top floor of the club. Midoriya stumbled away from the man and looked down to make sure it wasn't him, only to see his black hoodie begin to stain. He looked up in shock to see the man had already run off with the briefcase, before collapsing to the ground and losing consciousness. Izuku Midoriya had been cleaning up the sitting room when the house phone rang. She hurried over to the other side of the room to where it lay on its stand and picked it up, clicking the answer button. "Hello?" she asked into the phone. "Is this Izuku Midoriya?" came the reply only a few seconds later. "Yes," she said, becoming quickly concerned with the man on the other end. "We are going to need you to come to the hospital quickly. Your son has been shot," the man replied, calmly. Izuku immediately dropped the phone and ran out of the house. She had never ran so fast in her life to get to the hospital, which was only a 10-minute walk from where she and her son stayed. Those 10 minutes were cut down to a mere 3 because of how fast Izuku was running to reach her son's side. Upon reaching the hospital, she quickly went to reception and demanded, more rudely than she had intended to, that they tell her where her son was. The receptionist told her that he was currently undergoing surgery, so she would have to go to the waiting room until he was ready to have visitors. 6 hours passed before she was able to go in and see him. She followed the nurse that came to get her all the way to her son's room. She entered and immediately rushed to his bedside. He had not awoken yet. The doctor said that it may be another day or so. He also mentioned that Izuku had been lucky that the bullet did not hit anything vital like his lungs or his heart, and that he should make a very quick recovery. Izuku thanked the doctor for his help and took a seat beside her son. Having paced around the waiting room nervously for the better part of 5.5 hours, she was completely exhausted. Not long after the doctor left the room, Izuku found herself dragged into some much-needed sleep. She awoke many hours later to find herself, head in arms, on her son's bed. She sat up straight and rubbed the sleep her eyes. According to the doctor, Izuku would still be out for a little while, so she still had time to kill. After a few moments deciding what to do for now whilst awaiting her son to wake up, her stomach began grumbling. So she went to the hospital cafeteria in order to get herself something to eat. She left the room, closing the door behind her, and headed off toward the cafeteria. Meanwhile, back in the room, a blackish-purple smoke began to form at the bottom of Izuku's bed. This meant it could be only one person, Kurogiri. His timing appeared to be perfect, because the moment he stepped through, Midoriya began to awaken. His eyes fluttered open slowly, showing him he was in an unfamiliar place. He tried to sit up but felt a sharp pain shoot through his gut, which forced him to lie back down again. He looked down at the bottom of his bed to see Kurogiri standing there, which startled him. "Kurogiri, where am I?" he asked. "You're in the hospital, Midoriya. You got shot last night," Kurogiri answered. "According to the medical reports, you will be up on your feet again in 2 to 3 days. I have been sent to let you know that the master wants to speak to you as soon as possible." Midoriya nodded his head. He couldn't do much else. He was only really half listening to Kurogiri as he was more focused on trying to remember out what actually happened the previous night. He remembered that All for One had given him a mission to retrieve a briefcase from a nightclub a few blocks from the bar. He also remembered that he managed to successfully infiltrate the club and make it all the way to the room where the briefcase was. He remembered a man there, saying he had been waiting for All for One to send someone to get the briefcase back. He remembered getting into a scuffle with the man that eventually led to him getting shot by the man. He looked up at Kurogiri as the memories flooded back to him. "I have to go now, Midoriya. I'll see you in a few days," Kurogiri said before heading back through the portal and returning to the bar. Midoriya relaxed slightly and got himself more comfortable. A few moments later, Izuku returned to the room carrying a small pot of ramen to find that her son had awoken. "Izuku!" she exclaimed when she entered the room. "Thank goodness you are all right." She rushed over to him, putting her ramen down on the bedside table, before enveloping him in a hug. "You woke up a lot earlier than was expected," she told him, before pulling away. "I should go and tell the doctor that you are awake." With that, she once again left the room in search of the doctor that took care of him. She returned moments later with the doctor, who was keen to ask Izuku some questions. "So, do you remember anything about last night?" the doctor asked. "No, I'm afraid I don't. Most of last night is just a blur," Izuku lied, keeping eye contact with the doctor and trying his best to keep his demeanor calm. Well, the police found you in a room within the VIP suite of a nightclub a few blocks from here," the doctor said. "Can you think of any reason as to why you would be there?" "I'm sorry," Izuku told him. I really wish I could be of more help to you, but I really can't remember anything. That's fine, the doctor said. Well, the police will be in later to question you. I'm afraid you will be fined for being in a nightclub unsupervised and underage. If all goes well with the checkups, you should be out of here by tomorrow afternoon. The rest of the day went by with the police coming in to ask similar questions that the doctor had. The one thing they did do differently was ask for a description of the man who shot him. But, just like with the rest of the questions, Midoriya feigned memory loss and tiptoed around their questions. The next morning, Midoriya had to do the checkups the doctor mentioned the previous day, and was discharged by that afternoon. He phoned his mom and told her that he needed to go somewhere before coming home. She was worried that he might get hurt again, but he managed to convince her. He had to walk all the way to the bar, which was about 8 or 9 blocks from the hospital. He also passed the park on his way there, and thought about going for a walk in there first, but decided against it. He eventually reached the bar, entering and calling out to Kurogiri. The purple bartender gave his greetings before opening a portal and telling Midoriya to go through. He looked at Kurogiri curiously. "The master wants to see you, remember?" Kurogiri asked. Midoriya nodded his head and walked through the portal, instantly appearing in All for One's hideout. He walked over to the master and bowed in greeting. When he looked up, he saw All for One was gritting his teeth. This meant that he was rather annoyed about something. And in that moment, Midoriya had a vague idea of what was bothering him, but he didn't dare speak up. "You know, back when I was training Shigaraki, when he failed a mission I would give him a punishment," All for One said. "Do you know what it was?" Midoriya shook his head, now beginning to get very worried. He kept himself standing straight and looking at All for One, trying his best to hide his worry. He awaited All for One to continue, shaking ever so slightly at the thought of what he was going to say. "I had Kurogiri teleport him to the top of a mountain and he had to make his way down with nothing to help him," All for One said. "But I'm not going to have you do that. Instead, I'm going to give you a choice as to what your punishment shall be." All for One waited another moment before giving Midoriya the choices, allowing everything he said to sink in. "Now, the punishments won't be too bad as you have already been shot, but they will still be bad. Choice number 1, I will break every bone in your left hand one by one, and choice number 2, you will have a fight with Shigaraki that will last 2 minutes." Midoriya didn't hesitate to answer, "I think I'll take my chances with Shigaraki, sir." "Of course, I didn't expect anything else from you. But there is another condition to this. Both of your hands will be tied behind your back," All for One told him. Midoriya couldn't stop his eyes widening in shock. That wouldn't be a fight, it would be a one-sided bludgeoning. But he still wanted to take his chances with Shigaraki. After all, it was only 2 minutes. Shigaraki couldn't do too much damage in 2 minutes, but he couldn't defend himself. He nodded his head and left back through the portal to find Kurogiri there waiting for him. "Shigaraki is already in the training area awaiting your arrival, Midoriya," he said. "I have to come with you and tie your hands behind your back before you enter." They made their way rather hastily to the training room, Midoriya just wanting to get this over and done with as quickly as possible. Upon entering the room, Kurogiri used zip ties to tie Midoriya's hands behind his back before officially starting the fight. It ended up being just as one-sided as Midoriya assumed it would be, with Shigaraki immediately going on the offensive and not giving Midoriya any time to think. If he had, then he could have easily won the fight in just a few seconds. If he was given time to think, he would have noticed the various blunt, metal weapons littered around the room. By the end of the fight, Midoriya had a few cracked ribs, what he thought was a broken nose, and a black eye. Which, as he thought, was not as bad as having every bone in your hand broken. After the fight was over, Kurogiri fixed him up with some ice for his eye, before sending Midoriya back home. When he reached his house, he explained to his mom that he was at the park and he fell off the swings, which is where his injuries came from. Afterward he went to his room and laid on his bed. The last 2 days had been nothing but him picking up injuries. But he knew, if he wanted to become a great villain, then he would receive injuries much worse than he had over the last 2 days. Midoriya, just like he hoped, had passed the UA entrance exams with flying colors. Not only that, he got through with the top marks due to obtaining 60 hero points after destroying the 0-point robot and saving that girl. His acceptance letter came just a few days after getting out of the hospital. Inko was incredibly proud of him, and All for One was just glad that he hadn't failed 2 missions in the span of as many weeks. Midoriya was glad as well. Less than a year ago, getting into UA was nothing more than a pipe dream. Something that he could never obtain, but now, he was going to the most prestigious schools in the whole of Japan. But he had a mission though, to get information from the school and give it to the League of Villains so that they can formulate plans with as much time as possible. The hardest part will be obtaining that information before it is distributed to the rest of the student body. It may even require him to either hack into school records or break into the teacher meeting room to discover what the schedule is like. April 1st was 2 days away, so Midoriya would have plenty of time to formulate a plan in order to get the schedule to the League of Villains, without giving himself away to everyone as to what he was actually doing. He had training later that day but had the next day off as it was Sunday. By the time that April 1st rolled around, Midoriya had decided that it was too risky breaking into forbidden areas within the school in order to obtain what he needed, so his best option was to hack into school records to get the information. He'd have to wait to get home before attempting to do it though, so first he had to get through his debut at the country's most prestigious school. He had heard rumors that All Might himself would be teaching there this year. That may end up causing a few problems down the line, but he was going to deal with them when he needed to. Upon reaching the gate of UA, Midoriya had a look around and couldn't help but be mesmerized at how large the campus was. The main building was split into 4 different towers, all of them around 15 stories high. Midoriya had seen the building before, during the entrance exams, but it still surprised him to no end at how large the building actually was. He walked through the gates and got a good look at the grounds around the main building. He looked to his left and saw a clump of sakura trees, just like the one that he and Bakugo used to hang out at. He wanted to visit that tree and see if it was still there, or if it had been chopped down. Maybe if he ever got himself a girlfriend, then he could take her to see it as well. After all, it was spring, which meant the sakura trees were almost in full bloom. He shook the thoughts out of his mind and focused on finding his homeroom class. 1A. He made his way into the school and started to wander around. Finally, after around 10 minutes of searching, he found it. But something made him stop completely in his tracks. The size of the door. It had to be at least twice the size of him, maybe even thrice. There were already seating arrangements set up by whoever the homeroom teacher was. He was sitting at the far side, 3rd seat back. He looked to the seat he was sitting at and felt his face go pale. Maybe it was just his memories coming back to him. He was behind Bakugo. They hadn't spoken in quite a while. The day they were both forced to apologize to each other, he believed was the last time they ever said a word to each other. He wasn't scared of Bakugo anymore, but he couldn't stop himself. He took a moment to breathe and then made his way to his seat. He sat down and placed his bag down on the floor under his table. When 8 a.m. came, the bell rang and the door to the classroom opened, revealing an oversized yellow slug-like thing. Midoriya, like most of his classmates, was confused as to who or what this was. As it turned out, very anticlimactically, it was just a man in a sleeping bag. That man was Shota Aizawa, better known as the pro-hero Eraserhead. His quirk allows him to nullify another person's quirk for as long as he has it active whilst looking at them. Everyone wondered why their teacher had brought a sleeping bag to school until he took registration before dully saying, "I don't care what you do for the rest of homeroom as long as you don't disturb my sleep," and falling asleep right there on the floor. Midoriya just sat writing in a notebook that he keeps on him at all times. He made a profile on Eraserhead. From his name all the way down to his weaknesses. His main weakness appearing to be having to be at school at 8 o'clock in the morning. After he had done the profile, he spent the rest of the time making a little sketch of his new teacher. The bell rang, which woke Aizawa up, and he dismissed the class, irritated because he forgot homeroom only lasts 5 minutes. Classes went by rather quickly for Midoriya until he came to his last class of the day, Hero Studies, with the one and only All Might himself. The rumors had been true, and the man who had ruined his dreams of becoming a hero not even 12 months before, was going to be teaching him how he is supposed to become a hero. Today though, for their first lesson in Hero Studies, All Might had them split between teams of both heroes and villains. The heroes would then have to make their way through an abandoned labyrinth-type building and reach the floor where the villains were keeping a bomb, and all they had to do to win the exercise is either capture the villains or to touch the bomb. All Might had them draw numbers 1 to 10, He had made 2 sets of the numbers, so whichever number you drew, the other person who drew that number would be that person's partner. The teams ended up as follows. Team 1, Uraraka and Kaminari. Team 2, Midoriya and Ishido. Team 3, Mineta and Hagakure. Team 4, Todoroki and Koda. Team 5, Bakugo and Kirishima. Team 6, Jiro and Tokiyami. Team 7, Aoyama and Ojiro. Team 8, Iida and Asui. Team 9, Yaoyorozu and Shiro. Team 10, Sato and Shoji. With all the teams drawn, All Might determined that all the teams with even numbers were the heroes and all the teams with odd numbers were the villains. Finally he got them to draw lots once again to find out who they would be up against. The matches were Team 1 versus Team 6, Team 3 versus Team 2, Team 5 versus Team 10, Team 7 versus Team 4, Team 9 versus Team 8. Match 1 went by rather quickly as the two teams appeared to be completely outmatched. Kaminari, being so close to the bomb, was unable to use his electrical quirk in case he set the bomb off. Uraraka was as equally useless as all she was able to do was make things float. In the end, Tokiyami overpowered them with his quirk Dark Shadow and they apprehended their opponents. Up next was Midoriya's match. He had met up with Ishido, introducing themselves, and then got to planning. They were up against someone who was invisible and a little buddy who threw sticky purple balls that grew on his head. After taking the time to think it through, Midoriya had a plan. They stood outside whilst they awaited All Might's signal for them to begin, which gave them both an opportunity to have a chat. "So Midoriya, can I ask you something?" Ishido asked. "You just did," Midoriya replied, a little colder than he intended to. "Sorry, I suppose that was a bit rude." "It's fine," Ishido told him. "Anyway, would yo begin?" All Might's voice boomed through the speakers that were surrounding the building. "We should get going," Midoriya said. "We'll have plenty of time to talk later." "Yeah, okay," Ishido said, following Midoriya into the building. Midoriya prayed that his plan would come off without a hitch as they continued to wander through the building floor by floor. Eventually they came to the room where the bomb was, but they carelessly walked into the room only to find their feet stuck to those balls that Mineta had left out as a present for them. But neither of the two were in sight, until Mineta came out from behind the bomb, shaking in his boots. When he saw Midoriya and Ishido trapped, however, his whole demeanor changed and he began jumping and whooping until he felt something hard strike him on the back of the head, knocking him unconscious. Midoriya had taken control of a metal pipe lying a few feet away from Mineta and struck him in the head with it. "Ishido, use your acid to get us off of these things." Ishido quickly obliged and fired her acid at the balls, immediately disintegrating them. Once free, Midoriya started walking over to the bomb, only to be hit in the nose by some invisible force. That invisible force was the forgotten about Hagakure, who then pounced onto Midoriya to try and pin him down, but he managed to flip her off him and stand back up. Being unable to see his opponent was turning out to be quite an issue for Midoriya. Like a man fighting against thin air. "The heroes win," came All Might's cry over the speakers, and Midoriya turned to see Ishido standing with her hand on the bomb. "Thanks for the distraction, Midoriya," Ishido said. "How about dinner this weekend as payment for me winning this?" Midoriya couldn't help but smile at her. "Sure thing. It can also be an apology for how I acted earlier as well." As much as he hated to admit it, Midoriya was beginning to like Mina Ishido. A lot. That night he couldn't even concentrate on breaking into the school records to get the schedule, so he decided he would ring up Shigaraki for a favor. The next day, there were many reporters outside the school wanting a scoop on All Might. They were wanting to know if the rumors were true and that All Might was teaching the new crop of wannabe heroes. Midoriya had been swarmed that morning, as well as all of his classmates, before the security system that the school had set up stopped the reporters from entering the grounds. Just before Midoriya got swept up by the sea of students, he turned to see a familiar face in the crowd. Shigaraki had answered his plea, which made him grin. The previous night, as he was so embarrassingly love-struck that he couldn't concentrate on anything, he had phoned up Shigaraki and asked him to cause a distraction outside the school. His prayers were answered when, on his way to class, the security alarm went off. He looked out the window to see that the front gate was now a pile of dust. The security alarm going off meant that a person or a group of people that didn't have a pass had gotten onto the ground. Avoiding the cluster of students coming out of the classrooms, Midoriya headed the opposite direction from everyone else and got to the records room. Once inside, Midoriya got on a computer, quickly hacked into it, and pulled up the schedule. As he didn't have time to print it off, he took out his phone and snapped a picture with it, before sending it off to Kurogiri, saying that that's all the info he could get for now. He then logged back off the computer and left the room, quickly catching up to the rest of the student body. The only thing on the schedule for Class 1A was a trip that Friday to the unforeseen simulation joint, or as the school called it, the USJ. Midoriya had never actually heard of this place before, but apparently Kurogiri had and knew exactly where it was. No one had told Midoriya the plan they were hatching for the attack on the USJ. He would just have to be prepared for when it happened. They did, however, want a list of all his classmates and their quirks. It only took him a day to obtain those and hand them over to All for One. Midoriya had also been spending his lunchtimes with Mina, and they were beginning to grow close. He realized that he wanted to keep her safe from the attack on the USJ that Friday. He felt bad for doing this, but he put a special pill that Kurogiri had made for him in her drink, which had forced her to go home as she was throwing up constantly. She hadn't turned up for school on Friday, so Midoriya knew that he was in the clear. Packing away his things after sitting alone at lunch, he then went to get ready for the trip to the USJ. On the way, he kept his distance from everyone else and stayed within his own thoughts. When the class reached the USJ, they met the hero number 13, who told them what it means to be a rescue hero, and that today the class were going to be rescue heroes as well. Everyone seemed to be really excited, while Midoriya felt a little annoyed that he would have to save people. Then he realized how hypocritical he sounded, considering he had saved Mina from the villain's planned attack not even 24 hours beforehand. Once the briefing was over, Aizawa was getting ready to split people into groups, when a giant cloud of purple smoke began filling the plaza area. This was it, the attack was happening now. Midoriya readied himself, knowing full well to keep his cover he would have to fight. Out of the smoke came many people. Midoriya estimated at least 80 people, but they all just looked like random street thugs, not villains. Finally, out came Shigaraki, closely followed by a very large bird-type monster. Midoriya had never seen this thing before, but it looked terrifying. Shigaraki looked up at everybody at the top of the stairs, even meeting Midoriya's eyes for a few seconds. He couldn't make out Shigaraki's expression because of the hand covering his face, but he could tell that Shigaraki was smiling. After a few moments, he spoke. "I was expecting to see All Might here. Would any of you mind telling me where he is?" There was no vocal response from anybody. Both Bakugo and Todoroki made a move toward the villains before Aizawa pulled them back, then jumped down into the middle of the group of villains. "Hate to be the bearer of bad news," he said, putting on his yellow goggles. "But All Might isn't here, which means that you have to deal with me instead." As he finished speaking, he flung his scarf out and wrapped it around one of the thugs, and started swinging him around, knocking over several others in the process, before tossing him away and continuing his assault on them. Whilst Aizawa was down there fighting, number 13 was preparing them to be able to defend themselves. They said that someone is going to have to go and get help. Everyone immediately turned to Iida, being the fastest in the class with the boosters on his calves. He was reluctant to leave his fellow classmates in danger at first before finally giving in and running towards the door, only to be met by the purple smoke that brought all of the villains there in the first place, blocking his way. "Greetings to all of you," the cloud of smoke said. "Unfortunately for you all, my associates and I were hoping to see All Might here, so that automatically puts you all in more danger. I wish it was another way, but nothing can be done about that now. Anyway, I cannot let you leave, young man. In fact, it is my duty today to split you all up." After his little monologue, the smoke began to expand, covering the entire area. When it eventually cleared, there were only a few people left, including number 13, who was more than prepared to go on the attack. They turned to Iida, signaling him to get ready to run, before opening the caps on their fingers and activating their quirk Black Hole. Allowing them to act as a literal black hole and using powerful vacuums in their fingers to get rid of disasters such as tornadoes or even tsunami. This case, they were using Black Hole to try and vacuum up the smoke. They were succeeding as well, until a portal opened up behind number 13, causing them to rip themselves apart by their own doing, before collapsing to the ground. But because Kurogiri was distracted with number 13, he had completely forgotten about Iida, who had slipped out a few seconds ago. Infuriated with himself, He sent everyone else who was there into the middle of the plaza and the fight between the thugs and Aizawa, causing him to then be overpowered and outnumbered by the remainder of the thugs still standing. They began kicking him whilst he was lying on the ground, and some of the others went after the kids. Shigaraki, one of them, managed to get out. I was unable to stop him, but number 13 has been put out of commission, Kurogiri said as he appeared next to Shigaraki. That's fine, maybe he'll go and get All Might. Until then, Shigaraki paused, turning to the bird-like creature. Nomu, do me a favor and deal with Eraserhead. Immediately the Nomu, as Shigaraki had called it, pounced on Aizawa and began bashing his face into the ground. With a pool of blood forming around the hero's head, Nomu continued going. Aizawa eventually stopped struggling and lay limp on the ground. Finally, Shigaraki proclaimed, "He was beginning to really annoy me." With both the pro heroes down and out, they could now focus on their main goal, drawing out All Might. As if on cue though, the doors to the entrance burst open and in came the man of the hour, All Might. And for the first time for Midoriya, who unbeknownst to anybody other than Shigaraki and Kurogiri was hanging around behind a tree watching the whole thing, had seen All Might genuinely angry. He wasn't smiling like he normally did. He wasn't here to play around, he was here for a fight. By this point, more and more of the students had found their way back to the plaza from where they had been sent to by Kurogiri, including Todoroki, who immediately noticed upon reaching the plaza that Midoriya was lurking behind a tree near where the villains were. "Fear not, students. You will all be safe now, because I am here," All Might yelled from the top of the stairs. "Everyone take Mr. Aizawa and number 13 and get to safety." After saying this, he jumped down into the plaza, landing right in front of the Nomu. Not even a second later, the Nomu was sent flying across the plaza after All Might punched it. This started an all-out brawl between the two, and the toll that the battle was taking on All Might was beginning to show. Just then, Midoriya remembered something he learned a long time ago, All Might's weakness. He knew he had to tell Shigaraki somehow, but he didn't know how. He snapped a branch which made Shigaraki turn to him, then made a signal for him to come over. Shigaraki picked up on this before running forward and wrapping 4 fingers around his throat to make it look like he was attacking Midoriya. "What is it? I'm kind of in the middle of something here," he hissed, keeping his voice low so only Midoriya could hear it. "All Might has a weakness. The left side of his abdomen. If you attack it enough he should be beaten," was all Midoriya said before struggling out of Shigaraki's grasp and making a run for it. Todoroki, who had been watching the whole thing unfold, was beginning to get curious. How had Midoriya managed to get out of that villain's hold so easily? He would have to think about it later. Right now, he had to figure out a way to help All Might without getting in the hero's way. His ears perked up when he heard the hand villain speak again though. "Kurogiri, I've got a new plan." Kurogiri. Where had he heard that before? His eyes widened in realization. Midoriya. About a year ago he had met Midoriya in the park. He had heard Midoriya call out that name whilst running from a stunned Todoroki. Midoriya was working for the villains. He had to let everybody know. Just as he was about to call it out, a gunshot was heard, then a cry of pain. Shigaraki now had a hole in his left hand, courtesy of the arrival of the other staff members of UA here to the rescue. "Crap!" Shigaraki shouted. "Kurogiri, we need to go now. It's game over. Take the kid with us as well, we need to deal with him back at the base." Then, as quickly as they came, they were gone, along with Midoriya. "Young Midoriya!" All Might shouted. He hobbled over to where Midoriya stood just a few seconds before. "You don't need to be worried about him, All Might," Todoroki spoke up. "He's been working for them this whole time." To say that everyone was shocked would be an understatement. After all, one of the least likely people had been outed as a villain this whole time. Whoa, 2 chapters in one day? I just want to get this one finished so I can move on to the next story in the trilogy. Not that I don't like this story, it's just that I have really big plans for the sequel and I want to have it started as soon as possible, so there is a good chance I will have the next chapter out within the next 12 to 14 hours after the release of this one. Even after everyone had made it back outside, no one had said a word. Midoriya didn't seem like the type of person to be a villain. They assumed that Midoriya must have training in acting or something. The police had arrived and began rounding up the thugs. There were 84 of them total that had attacked the USJ, 85 if you wanted to count Midoriya, and 4 had escaped. The aforementioned Izuku Midoriya, Tamura Shigaraki, Kurogiri and the Nomu were all still on the loose and needed to be apprehended as soon as possible. Yaoyorozu was the first person to say anything out of the group. I think we should tell Mina, out of everyone here besides Bakugo. She knows Midoriya the most. Maybe she can give us some information. She is also the person who deserves to know the most that her boyfriend is a villain. The plan failed horribly though, as everyone soon realized that Midoriya was the only person with her number. They would have to wait till they got back inside and get her home number from the school records, with permission from Principal Nezu of course. The walk back was also rather silent, the only noise coming from the quiet whispers of Nezu and Detective Naomasa Tsukachi of the police. One could understand what they were saying, not that anyone was really listening to them anyway. They were all too caught up in their own thoughts to really do anything. When they eventually reached the school again, all of Class 1A followed Nezu to the records room where he logged onto the computer and pulled up Mina's school profile. He found what he was looking for under contacts. Yaoyorozu put the number into her phone and pressed the call button. It rang 3 times before someone picked it up. "Hello?" came a voice on the other line. "Mina, it's Momo. Are you able to get to the school as quickly as possible? We all need to speak with you. It's really important," Yaoyorozu replied. "Of course. I'm still a bit sick but I'll get there as soon as I can," Mina told her. "That's great. Thank you," Yaoyorozu said before hanging up the phone. "How could you do this?" Shigaraki screeched. "You have known about this for almost a year and you never thought to tell us?" "Well, I was a little preoccupied with getting kidnapped by you to remember any of it," Midoriya replied calmly, even though he had Shigaraki screaming in his face. "I just don't understand how you can forget something that important," Shigaraki yelled. His voice was beginning to leave him with how much he was shouting. "Shigaraki, you are being UNR, all for one tried to say, but was quickly cut off by a still infuriated Shigaraki. "No, you stay out of this, Master. This has nothing to do with you. This kid has failed time and time again. I am sick of it." Midoriya just stood there, taking the brunt of everything Shigaraki had to say. He knew he had messed up, but there was nothing he could say that would change Shigaraki's opinion on the matter. All for one tried to butt in again, but Shigaraki marched over and slammed the laptop shut, silencing him. "Kurogiri, I want you to go to his house and retrieve his mother and bring her back here," Shigaraki called to the bartender. Realizing he had no other choice, Kurogiri created a portal and walked through, ignoring the pleading look on Midoriya's face. But now that Shigaraki was bringing Midoriya's mother here, he was beginning to lose his temper. "What are you bringing my mother here for? She hasn't done anything to you," Midoriya yelled. "Because it appears that you never learn your lesson when we hurt you, so we are gonna try hurting the one person that you love." Shigaraki was still shouting, but it was less than before. Kurogiri returned to the bar with Inko in tow. She looked over to see her son standing with a panicked look on his face. "Izuku? What's the matter?" she asked him. Midoriya couldn't bring himself to reply, instead he could feel his eyes welling up, on the verge of a mental breakdown. He dreaded to think what Shigaraki planned to do to her. "Don't worry, kid," Shigaraki said. "I'll make sure that it's quick and painless for her." He then pulled out a gun and aimed it at her head. Inko was beginning to panic now as well. She had no idea what these people wanted, or why her son was there, or why the blue-haired one had a gun to her head. She looked over at her son for answers, but his eyes were focused on the hardwood floors of the bar. "Izuku, look at me and tell me what's happening," she said. "I'll tell you, lady. Your son is a villain. He has been failing mission after mission for us, so we punished him, but he kept failing. I've gotten fed up of it, so now I'm going to kill you and hope that it sets him straight," Shigaraki explained. "Shigaraki, don't," Midoriya yelled out, finally speaking again. "She hasn't done anything wrong. Just kill me instead and let her go." "Sorry, kid. I said I was gonna kill her, so that's what I'm doing," Shigaraki told him. Midoriya began to run forward to try and stop Shigaraki. "No, Mom." He began to feel anger bubbling and boiling over within, as he slowly laid her back on the ground, then stood up. Those vibrant green eyes that always shone, now seemed void of any color. He raised his right hand, and pulled the gun out of Shigaraki's hand and toward him, catching it and turning it on the other. Midoriya, think about what you're about to do here. If you cross this line now, there is no coming back for you, Kurogiri said from behind him. I have thought about it, Midoriya replied, and I've decided that he needs to die as well. Shigaraki's eyes widened. No, he didn't want to die. He still had so much he needed to do, so much he needed to improve in the world. He was the leader of the League of Villains, therefore it was his duty to enforce his beliefs as the group's. As the realization sunk in, he wanted to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. There was no way he was talking his way out of this one, so he hoped that Kurogiri would be able to talk the kid down for him. You killed her, Shigaraki. Why? Because I messed up a few times? Is that any reason to kill someone's parent? Midoriya was on the verge of hysterics. If someone couldn't calm him down, he was going to do something he would surely regret later. My mother did absolutely nothing to you. And you've killed her. How would you feel if the roles were switched, and I shot your mother in the head, whilst you watched? The others in the room were at a loss for words. They had never seen him like this before. Nobody had, but Midoriya was reaching his breaking point now. He was waving the gun he had taken from Shigaraki around like a maniac. I could just kill you, Midoriya said, but no, I want you to suffer first. With that, he shot Shigaraki in both of his legs. The other man collapsed to the ground, yelling in pain. Midoriya then took aim again, and shot Shigaraki in both his arms. All the training Shigaraki had given Midoriya was now coming back to bite him. Having a revolver meant that Midoriya had one bullet left, and he knew exactly where to put it. Shigaraki had resorted to rolling on the floor and mumbling to himself. Midoriya ignored him, raised the gun to just the right height, looked Shigaraki in the eyes, and fired. Mina Ishido had received a call from Yaoyorozu and was now hurrying to the school as fast as her sickly figure would carry her. Her normal bright pink-colored skin was now an ugly shade of purple. Anyone would be able to tell from a mile away that she didn't look very well. But the way Yaoyorozu spoke on the phone, it sounded very serious. Around 20 minutes after her call with Yaoyorozu ended, she finally reached the school. Everyone was there, besides her boyfriend. She was wondering where he was, but she wouldn't have to ponder it for long, as Yaoyorozu just cut straight to the point. Mina, due to recent events and surfacing evidence, we have come to the conclusion that Midoriya is working with the villains, she said. Mina was shocked, to say the least. Granted, she had only known Izuku for a few days, but she felt she knew him better than anyone did. Even Bakugo, who had known him for years, most likely didn't know him better than her. He had always seemed like such a nice person. The least likely out of anybody in their class to be a villain. How did you find out? She asked Yaoyorozu. A little under a year ago, I met Midoriya at the park. A flash went off and I heard him say the name, Kurogiri. Before he disappeared, Todoroki spoke up. This Kurogiri guy was one of a large group of villains that attacked us at the USJ today. There was also footage of Midoriya breaking into the records room the day the news reporters got onto the grounds on Tuesday. He had pulled up a schedule file before taking a photo of it. We only found the footage because we realized that particular 5 minutes was missing from the tapes, Yaoyorozu said. Luckily, the school has a backup for all the security tapes which weren't deleted. Okay. So what you are saying is that Midoriya broke into the school records and took a photo of the schedule, and also that he knows one of the villains. But is that all you need to incriminate him like this? Mina asked. Just before you got here, we received word from the hospital that the rescue hero number 13 is dead and that Mr. Aizawa will never see again. If Midoriya is indeed involved, then he will need to be brought to justice for his involvement, Yaoyorozu said. Okay. Let me call him, Mina said. I'll see if I can convince him to come in for questioning quietly. She took out her phone and pulled up her contacts, clicking Midoriya's name. They could all hear a ringing, but it was coming from Midoriya's bag which he had left on the bus. Clearly he had left his phone there as well, so there was no way to get a hold of him. Damn it! Mina shouted as she put her phone away again. Now we will never find him. Kurogiri, I need a favor from you, Midoriya said. Of course, Midoriya. What is it? Kurogiri asked. I need you to get me access to every electronic device in the entire city, or find someone who can, Midoriya replied. I can do it, Midoriya, Kurogiri told him, but it might take a few hours. Well, whilst I wait for you, I guess I'll clean up this mess I made, Midoriya said. gesturing to the two dead bodies lying on the floor. "We will need to move though. There is no way that nobody heard those 6 gunshots. The police could be here any minute." "Well then let's take this elsewhere," Kurogiri said, opening a portal and walking through, and Midoriya following close behind, carrying his mother and the now freshly reloaded revolver, having just found some bullets in Shigaraki's pocket with him. Upon walking through, Midoriya realized that Kurogiri had taken him to the #1 most watched news station in the entire country. "You may not need me to hack into every device in the city, when you can broadcast yourself to tens of millions of homes in the country," Kurogiri told him. "Thank you, Kurogiri," Midoriya said. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have a broadcast to interrupt." With that, he marched off toward the broadcasting area, reaching it rather quickly as Kurogiri had teleported them very close to the room. He walked inside the room and immediately shot one of the news anchors in the head with incredible precision, killing the man instantly. "Listen up," he shouted. "Keep that camera rolling, everyone in the country is gonna hear what I have to say." He walked right in front of the camera, made himself look sort of presentable, even though he was covered in his mother's blood. "Good afternoon, Japan," he began. "My name is Izuku Midoriya and I have a request to make. About 15 minutes ago my mother was killed by a group called League of Villains leader Tamura Shigaraki. I have been part of this organization for a little under a year now, and we just attacked the USJ this afternoon, which had me and my classmates at UA High School within it. In a blind rage I killed Tamura Shigaraki, which now makes me the leader of the League of Villains." He paused for a moment, before continuing. "The request I have is for all the wannabe villains in Japan. Join me and we will start a war against the so-called heroes that this society puts on a pedal. If any of you come across a hero, do not be afraid to take them on. If you see a bank, don't be afraid to rob it. Finally, if you see a civilian, don't be afraid to kill them." To emphasize his point, he turned toward the other 2 news anchors behind him, and shot them both, before turning back to the camera. "On behalf of all the villains of Japan, I, Izuku Midoriya, am declaring a war on the heroes of this country." He finished with a polite bow, before firing a bullet into the camera. A mere 10 minutes after the broadcast ended, half the country was in complete chaos. Midoriya had started a civil war within Japan, and he felt amazing. His eyes had finally been opened to the horrors of the world, and all it took was somebody killing his mother. He had since gotten over it, losing almost all his humanity and sense of morality in the process. Now there was just one thing he needed to take care of to be free of the shackles of the heroes. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.